Hello everyone, today we talk about Western Iranian and Islamic Caucasian warfare between the mid-11th to the mid-14th century. This is part of a series that, as you know, takes in consideration essentially the main features of a given region. In fact, in this kind of high or full medieval times, military speaking, and it's basically about the entire Eurasia, the Mediterranean, so it's progressing slowly as we pick really vast areas, and naturally they're concentrated in the West. I mean, I think the last one was about medieval Portuguese warfare, as a matter of fact, so the scales of the regional here varies by some degree, and as you know, this is just literally an introduction to, say, other series I make about specifically the army organization, tactics, historical military units, battles, right? So that will eventually consolidate further around this introductory videos, the pulp, the substance in the form. But in fact, the form is crucial, because if we don't get the essentials right, sometimes I start talking about certain events without a context, and it's important to cover these regions like that. And some regions, especially especially a Western perspective is concerned, is not kind of deeply kind of imbued, ingrained in our kind of cultural awareness. And this one, the Western Iranian lands, the Islamic Caucasus. I made a video about Georgian warfare. At a point we will talk about the Armenians. Those will be left out, right? This video covers specifically Western Iran and most of Iran in this sense, so parts of the Islamic world inhabited by peoples speaking Indo-European languages, and excluding instead the Christian Armenians and Georgians, the latter which, again, we have already discussed introductively. So we were looking at Western Iran, and including the Turks living at this point in Azerbaijan and in the neighboring Iranian province of Azerbaijan. These Turks were relative newcomers to the region, that essentially from the 7th mostly century AD, the western steppes had somehow Turkified, and these areas of Azerbaijan, we've seen it also for the White Ship Turks video I made a couple of years ago. They were essentially the same. They were settled essentially in the same places, in fact, and that were a bit like middlemen between the more sedentary areas of Iran and, in fact, the steppes north of the Caucasus, or in fact north of the same Iran. And as we will see now, these would play an important role, at least as far as paving the way to some kind of settlements and kind of governmental models that were exploited also by sedentary, urbanized Iranian ruling dynasties as a supply of, in fact, steppes horsemen. We will also take in consideration the Kurds living essentially today in this area comprised between Iran, Iraq, and southeastern Turkey. This means naturally that we will partially address also some regions as the Jazeera and even the Rum, so Anatolia, in the far west, because there are interesting points of intersection even with external cultures that now we don't discuss, but that are there and that affected these people's warfare. Sometimes even on a very long range geographically. The eastern edge of this area, so where does this end? Towards the east, and why do do we split Iran in two? Well, this limit includes the Farsi-speaking Kerman area in southern Iran, not quite on the Persian Gulf, but just immediately inland. It also excludes the Turkic Uran at the southeastern corner of the Caspian Sea, because even though, as we will see now, it had been ruled by the Buvahids or Buyids in the early 11th century, this area would fall under kind of other influences, right? The main divide here is east and western Iran. Also, if you look at the north, there are different, in fact, different influxes that separate a bit these areas. Eastern Iran is much more Central Asian influenced, right? I think I described these things. I have a medieval Persian warfare playlist when I discuss especially the Ilkhanate, and we've seen how I think it was the video on the heavy cavalrymen of the Ilkhanate that observed this kind of greater Central Asian features in the zootechnic profile of the Persian horsemen. Right, the West was more urbanized, was closer to more urbanized areas such as Mesopotamia, and had through the Caucasus also a lot of influence from the West, right, through Anatolia as well, through the Kurds, right? So this spaces do evolve in slightly different ways, and this is the reason why we will treat eastern Iran together with other regions further north and east together, because they have more common characteristics. So we mentioned the Buvayids or Boyids that were essentially the western parallel to the Ghaznavids to the east. Actually, their frontiers flowed quite a lot. Also, the Ghurids of Afghanistan had covered great part of Iran, and the Buvayids had, in fact, more in common with the latter than the Ghaznavids, that are instead more eastern profiled. Right, so we will talk about them at some other point. So the Ghurids, as much as the Buvayids, stemmed from a mountainous area, that is the Dailam, which, as we'll see now, will play a major role in the region in terms of military culture. The Dailam is located south of the Caspian Sea, right, and it was, if you want, actually a very backward power. They were essentially mountaineer communities, and in fact their armies consisted almost entirely of highland infantry, right? And these areas had historically always been kind of more sedentary than the surrounding steppes, and that's why it's an interesting frontier. If you look at ancient Hyrcania, etc., you will find historically, actually, in fact, famous infantries that were used as mercenaries also by these surrounding powers that very often counted. Think about the Parthians, let's say, on at least at some point in their history, on mostly cavalry. But that, if you look sometimes at the origins, and I'm not talking about the Parthians specifically, but considering the lands that the Parthians conquered initially within the Seleucid Empire, they were mostly not, nomadic. They were sedentary, and infantry in an initial period figured prominently. The Buvayids from Dailam had, again, a major impact on basically the entire Middle Eastern warfare. They ruled essentially on a large portion of it from the mid-10th century until essentially their political disintegration in the early to mid-11th century, right? So we're not talking about particularly stable areas in the first place, and there are broader reasons, right? When I talk about the Middle East, I mean the Middle East proper, because many people say whatever is, I don't know, Asia, just Levant is the Middle East. No, there is a Near East and then a Middle East. The Middle East is fundamentally from it can vary as a definition, but at least from Iraq as far as the entirety of Iran, at least, right? And so it's this space which includes, in fact, a wide. It's mostly Mashrek, as you understand, but it does include in the north an important amount of kind of nomadic areas. There are there is the Abbasid Caliphate at this point in Baghdad, but Buwayhids go as far as, in fact, dominating over the Abbasid caliphs, and this was a huge deal at the time, also showing a bit the end of the Islamic Golden Age, because differently from the Abbasids, they naturally were Sunni, the Buwayhids were Shia Muslims. So it's the majority of today's Iranians, and as such, they wouldn't recognize the spiritual authority of the Sunni Caliph in Baghdad. I am trying to think about possible analogies, but it's really thing on their own, except the deep rivalry that had always existed between the Arab and the Persian worlds. That at some point had been, of course, with the Islamic invasions, had been exacerbated in a way. Naturally, they were not just two monolithic blocks, as we will see now. However, the general Shia, majority in Persia had always been, even just because of the land, as a politically and strategically a looming threat over Baghdad. And at some point, as you know, under al-Mamun had even, risked, let's say, to become Shia, right? There could have been something like that. And of course, there were lots of other conflicts on the level of ethnic, political rivalries and so on beyond these religious divisions. But let's say there are two importantly separated spheres, right? The Abbasids are in Mesopotamia, these powers here, the Buwayhids, are in Iran. And as you know, the thing we'll talk about it now would evolve with essentially the Seljuk, essentially always a Persian domination over the Caliphate at some point, right after the end of the Golden Age, and later with the Mongols that actually destroy Baghdad. But in general, that was a terrible catastrophe, as we understand. However, that's also a good reason why we should make more videos about this, because the influence naturally of Persian culture on Arab warfare is very strong. Since the beginning, as the entire ideology, you can argue that the same Islam is just basically a copy of the Indo-European, Persian creed and religion, and there is more to that, but the rivalry had never ended in that regard. Except there were also, as we'll see today, in the Turks and the Mongols that weren't the Persians, as they weren't the Arabs either, right? So this continuous waves from the east, from Central Asia, would also significantly affect the asynchrosis between the Arab and the Persian military traditions. So huge dominations, very often put together in a very patchy way. The main reason being Iran being a frontier country, right? Where you have a millenary urban tradition, but at the same time some areas that are much more pastoral and feudal in nature, and thus never being quite as stable like the properly the deeply urbanized and kind of military civilized sense of nomadic in nature areas of the Jazeera, right? That were naturally destabilized at this point as well, so that you will always find them actually in the late Middle Ages. There is not such a thing like a Mesopotamian civilization anymore. It's just something in between. Whichever power ruled the Levant, could be the Mamluks or later the Ottomans, and an Iranian power instead. It's still the case today, frankly. So this is a product of a constant push from the east, from this kind of Iranian lands were sedentary enough, but were always kind of replenished also in strength by nomadic settlements / conquests that, however, ended up being absorbed by the local Persian culture, right? Now, as we were saying, the Dailames, Buvayids, had a very typical kind of warfare that wasn't nomadic at all. It was mostly based on infantry, and it would remain so until the end of the dynasty. Even though, naturally, this Highlanders, as long as they expanded in this enormous regional space, were obliged to provide themselves with other warriors. This had already been the case of the Ghaznavids, for example. And you see in this 10th, 11th century a passage, in fact, under the Buvayids between a typically kind of early Islamic, we can say national army of freeborn warriors supplemented by volunteers, kind of religious fanatics, militias, other auxiliaries, so also foreigners, to a later phase, full-time professional kind of army, at least in the core, in fact constituted by a nucleus of elite gulams / Mamluk, say slave serf soldiers. Right. This passage is crucial because it corresponds to, in fact, the end of not just of the Islamic Golden Age per se, but also that kind of initial conjunction between an ethnic, tribal, native element that could rule from either like kind of a national base, or mostly had been in the Arab, or also the Dailamis case, kind of at least a peripheral area that eventually could rule from a relatively short distance over a bigger one, to a properly feudal army of sort, right? What happens with the end of the Islamic Golden Age is the disgregation of the ancient, essentially Roman state, right? You can easily see how essentially the Arabs had superimposed themselves to the Roman state. This is true also as far as the Abbasid Caliphate did in Mesopotamia with the Sasanian rule that, however, had significantly in this area, as we've seen before, departed from the Iranian kind of feudal space, and where the Sasanians had tried, in fact, to centralize in a similar way that the Romans would. And this naturally brought to a degree of, first of all, political fragmentation, then privatization and professionalization of the armies. It is essentially the history of the Seljuk Empire that, yes, was huge initially, but then fragmented immediately, and remained always fragmented, and just developed this kind of feudal principalities that were, yes, like held together by the common dynastic ancestry by name, but that de facto pursued also very, very autonomous, but not properly antagonistic policies against one another. So the Dailames found themselves essentially in this condition, also because when you have a larger empire, you must necessarily structure your armed forces with a professional corps that can mount up expeditions on a regional scale of some sort. So with just the type of warriors that now we will describe the Dailames had originally ethnically from their highlands, this would have been impossible. You needed, in fact, properly professional troops, of retinues of warlords that could rule also properly in a feudal sense, meaning having a lot of land to dominate through mounted warfare, and thus a much greater degree of at least estates control, right, the private possessions in a single hand, right, and it would be dynastically passed down to the heirs, and with this constant fuel arriving from the steppes in the form of, in fact, of nomadic horsemen, gulams, Mamluks. Naturally, gulams in the Islamic Caliphate and beyond had been mercenaries really coming from many different areas, but in this case, right, in Persia, the most obvious, the most frequent ones, and also simply the ones that would arrive by themselves, exploiting the local political instability, were Central Asians. They were mostly Turks, right, and they would remain so to the point, in fact, of taking over the entire system. Right? And the same goes for the Mamluks later as they installed themselves in Egypt. But we will see, especially when talking about the Kurds now, how the flux had been continuous. Right? In the West, you don't have quite this concept, because at the end of the day, the Latin Germanic structures consolidated enough, even if more slowly compared, say, to the Statal model of the Byzantines or the Cordobans, but eventually managing to be so entrenched and glued and kind of holding together that they absorbed basically any kind of movement that came from the steppes. These Middle Eastern areas wouldn't, right? It would always be permeated by the movements of these raiders coming from very far away, sometimes even just hearing news of the next campaigns in Mesopotamia, in Syria, wherever, and just being exploited as such by the local rulers to always have fresh new units that could counter the ones that they would inevitably have to settle down in exchange for their service, because yes, these were fairly rich areas, but not without dramatic kind of financial, banking development, things like this. So again, the state was quite unstable, was quite private, was quite feudal in nature. And Persia would always have this ups and downs, would have invasions, would have, again, dynastic changes, and so on. So this was the quickest and, in a sense, in the short term, in fact, convenient way to create armies, right? With the, however, problem of always having, at the end of the day, a private system with a lower degree of centralization. So in most Buwahid armies, these two elements, so the Daylami national forces from one side, and then the ruler's personal following, because it was mostly the dynasts would need kind of a private force to oppose to the greater native community, wanted to maintain kind of a more egalitarian background, but also in this sense a more conservative one that was not suitable even just for the development of adequate armored forces, were quite well balanced to the point that they achieved essentially an equal status. This is interesting because the Gulams, as you know, were slaves themselves technically. These were now fully Islamic realities, so there was the point that most of them were pagans. They had to yet be converted to Islam, and so on. And as equal as they would be, they were also quite antagonistic. There was an intense rivalry between them because, naturally, again, this happens often also. We've seen it often with the Mamluks that we discussed many times, that essentially the Mamluk as a slave was actually a more powerful person than the average freeman in those communities. And so I will not digress yet again on what Islamic slavery as such consists of, but as you know, is a bit more complicated thing than just brutally prostrated slave in chain that just does whatever it wants, because you couldn't have an effective military and nor an effective knighthood in that fashion. So it's something more similar to what you see, for example, with the German ministeriales during the same period, right, in Central Europe. So serfs, not slaves, quite. And so people that could also, through this private system, actually quite rise to the very top, to the point of even establishing, in fact, their own dynasty in Egypt and having essentially the largest power in the Near East for centuries. So let's look a bit better at what Dailami native warfare was about, because these were warlike and somehow culturally backward people. There is no doubt about this. As it often happens in moments of political instability, especially talking about the High Middle Ages, where, of course, resources were also more limited. So at some point, at the collapse of some dynasties, as we've seen even the same Buwayids have a sort of, they have a nominal control of a very large amount of territory, but the direct control is quite often escaping from the majority of it. So you can have a punching force of a kind of a ethnic kind of mass, right, homogeneous mass that manages to break through and overriding some of the most important centers, holding them, say, also from a quite skilled military, or at least a quite strongly warlike mindset, right? So a much more motivated people living on the mountains, being avid of prey, knowing how much riches are worth, and so that want to grab as much as possible because they're very driven by their repression, in a sense. It's also how the Arabs come out of the desert and manage to take over everything, because they have a strong sense of the meaning of resources that kind of more civilized and gentrified and soften up people do not say, okay, well, we're rich, but, who cares? We can also spend, and, not thinking too much about limiting the cost. For these kind of more barbaric populations, even just a tiny amount was an enormous wealth, and so they saw in their military success, a heavenly accomplishment. Naturally, this doesn't mean that they were necessarily more capable than the civilized peoples to maintain that power, but at that moment they were capable, at least, of exploiting the weakness of civilization to sediment a consistent power. Naturally, it may happen on Schwerpunkt that I will talk more in detail about these populations, their military history. Any option is open, really. However, today we give really the essential. The Dailamis really looked in the sources of the time as the primitive brute, right? They were hirsute in appearance, that seemingly have an excessive love for garlic. I have nothing against garlic personally, but at least they seemingly had one, right, in the excess, in the positive sense. They had the habit, for example, from a military point of view, to hang their swords from baldricks, like the early Arabs, right, at the time of the conquest, rather than from sword belts, as by this point the Iranians and the Turks both were habituated. This may have to do just with their type of warfare that, as we'll see now, was much more foot-based. So also the agility required, kind of in mountain warfare, the necessity to pass from one weapon to another, at least for an infantryman, takes a different form that from the Iranians and the Turks that were kind of more kind of equestrianly oriented. In any case, the Dailamis had a reputation of good soldiers, right? And this tells you how, like, even when we look at in history, the peoples that emerged tendentially are also in fact, among some of the most primitives initially, when they can provide with such kind of strong and continuous military service, because their society fundamentally works in that direction, right? Sending war bands out there at every generation, seeking fortune, and for the rest living entrenched, in this case in some mountains where can even be overrun by greater powers, but that never quite fully and directly and capillarly control. So these communities will keep kind of putting out new hardware, let's say, at least in human terms, demographic terms, and this was the case, right? As you know, by the 10th century, maybe we didn't discuss it excessively. Made a video about Arab warfare, Arab tactics back in the day. There were pretty advanced, military techniques, right? They're pretty large, powerful armies. We are at the peak, really, even of in the Byzantine Empire, that is really next door. I don't know, the top of the cataphract tradition at the time, that surely also technologically had something more than in the West, that it was also developing its own heavy cavalry. This stuff is, its own, feudal cavalry, let's say better. And in these, something similar was happening, yet these Dailames were mostly infantrymen, right? Serving as far afield as places like Afghanistan, Syria, Egypt, since at least the 10th century. So actually fairly late in time in that regard. Sure, infantry warfare was important also in these areas that had even some fierce infantrymen, but apparently the brutality, right, the fierce nature and character of the Dailames made these troops very very prized and reliable, at least in terms of military effectiveness. In particular, they seem to have been the best when operating with the support of close combat cavalry, such as that they would adopt themselves of the Turkic gulams, right? So naturally, the combined armed tactics were the key to any military success at this point. And again, for the Dailames to become a regional power, such step of integrating other arms in their military was necessary. Still, the course seemingly remained initially infantry. The most typical Dailami weapons, at least in fact in that period, were a set of javelins or short spears called zupins, which at least are said, because we don't have a dramatic archaeological evidence of this, but double-ended, as well as a large and highly decorated shield. So quite basic equipment. Of course, they had another weapon like a sword, battle axe, and bow sometimes. This last possibly using the Navak or Myra arrow guide to shoot short arrows, being present in their arsenal. Thus, essentially, again, an infantry-based force that is capable of it must aggress kind of at close range, right? Even though being habituated to archery, which was a necessity for all these sedentary peoples, as they had been always exposed from millennia to warfare against the nomads. That, however, is capable of entrenching, of defending, of protecting themselves. This large shield and the importance placed in it, as we'll see now culturally, seems to indicate it, right? So peoples that would be able to resist under hails of arrows, and then when the enemy was exhausted, passing to counterattack with kind of shock weapons like battle axes, things like this. So typical Highlander warfare in many ways. There was naturally a heavier element, as we'll see now. This is the one that evolved essentially towards a knightly direction, also on horseback, that emerges when we are told that the shields were carried into battle by younger men or youths, some kind of esquires acting as shield bearers, right? That shields that naturally could break even clashing among same infantrymen in many ways. Always remember that why is this warfare the way it is? It's because most of the first enemy they fight against is themselves, right? Like every people, where it's unlikely even to be exposed to particularly different enemies that you've never seen. So this was the Dailami traditional warfare. These heavier troops with retinues, with squires and so on, surely had heavy armor. Albeit, it seems that this defense was less effective than the one of the Turkic gulams, at least against arrows, right? And in the Dailami's case, it mostly consisted of mail, by the way. So the picture, of course, we get is that the steppe horseman just has better, especially torso, protection because of flank attacks, kind of more dynamic tactics, etc. Whereas this sturdy mountaineers infantries could just, say, create some shield walls to parry the waves of arrows, and just again necessarily passing to counterattack at some point, but in a frontal sense. There's not much you can do with that infantry on, right? We're not informed of any particularly developed tactical capacity based, let's say, on, I don't know, maneuvers with wings or whatever. Of course, there was some of that, by a degree, but mostly was brutal frontal force, right? Which is the one that literally helped even against more mobile enemies, because you can, in conditions of moral superiority, of course, break through even enemy cavalry or Turkic one, as they had to face it on a regular basis during their the establishment of their empire. The documented Buvayid tactics rely in fact upon heavy infantry maintaining a solid front even when advancing, so even counterattacks being quite cautious, because of course of the nomadic tactics that mostly would carry out hit and run tactics, and we will see now the Dailamis doing the same thing in the traditional Arab Karbafar style. So the concept being, yes, I can counterattack, but the most important thing is to maintain cohesion, because if I start essentially detaching infantry units, this can be easily outflanked, surrounded, especially when they're chasing some cavalry that may at some point turn back when the infantry is exhausted and is cut away from the rest of the army and being slaughtered, right? That's why the Dailami cavalry was important as well. They had some of their own. It was mostly heavy or light cavalry, not as heavy as we will see now to the Turkic one, that had probably a different background, a different armament and tactics. The Dailami cavalry being divided into detachments for carrying out either the Karbafar tactic and or for kind of screening the infantry and or, of course, scouting, finding out eventual ambushes or other enemy tricks, right? And so creating some sort of protective hub for the infantry to move, to advance. Naturally, when you have regional ambitions, you're going for kind of a also consistent amount of siege warfare that requires infantry consistently, not just to numerically to surround the fortifications, but also an assault component to storm them meaningfully enough. Operating on such a large territory and coping with so many different enemies, especially skilled from the east in mounted warfare, the proportion of Dailami cavalry in increased considerably by the 11th century. Right, this would be natural, as also the Buvayid success had brought their aristocracy to just afford more. Mounted warfare was just naturally a prerogative of the elite already, but increasing it, and also not just in armament, but also in tactical specialization. So that, of course, if you have heavier cavalry, you also need kind of more lighter one to in fact render, to shield it in some way, to render it able to operate in the first place. So with engagements, we were more open field based, and so where the shock element, that the use of reserves was crucially developed in combined armed tactics and increasing collective training compared to what just an army of mountaineers had been historically capable of doing. Yet the Dailami cavalry always maintained kind of a more primitive bias, right? Acting mostly as mounted infantry on occasion, right? Some did serve as genuine cavalry, of course, but this necessity of still, exploiting both the traditional fighting style that couldn't simply change in 1 century all of the sudden, especially considering that the Dailami still remained, of course, an important pool of recruitment, characterized this kind of cavalry, which had some characteristic weapons as well, such as the taberzin, so literally the saddle axe, which was a light, in fact, axe designed for use on horseback. Right, this had been typical of these areas from quite a long time, and the Dailami troops fought with these skills in many other places, as we were saying before, as far, for example, as Fatimid Egypt, that also had a hell of a military and thus required some of the finest troops as well that these warriors embodied. Very similar in their Dailami military traditions were the people of Gilan, right? This was yet another warlike country, but very similar to the Dailam, and that laid, in fact, just north of it. It was a lowland area bordering the Caspian Sea. The only significant difference between these two populations is that while the Dailamis were Shia Muslims, the Gilanis were Sunnis, right? So there was a fierce rivalry between them too, because different powers sponsored them, one against the other, especially considering being such a distant and difficultly tameable pool of for military forces, mercenary forces as well at some point. So it was the Seljuks who overthrew the Buvayid state, right? As you know, the Seljuks had interesting origins, stemming even from the Oghuz Khaganate that they had actually contributed to destroy. They started as a small group, right? A tribal force devoted to mercenarism, mostly fighting in steppe nomadic style, primarily as horse archers, but naturally, as everywhere in the steppe, with a core of both qualitatively and numerically elite heavy cavalry. The Seljuks naturally that affirmed themselves as a dynasty mostly, and they kept attracting many other peoples, primarily Turks, of course, but from really very varied background. Consider that, again, the steppes, the Western Eurasian steppes had been practically Indo-European up to a few centuries before, so many people that we call Turks, actually they were just so in a cultural sense, but they they had very different origins. Could be Indo-European, could be Mongol already, and so on. The most important aspect as far as our region is concerned is that the great Seljuk state, so the one from which most military power was put out, was centered in Iran, right? When we talk about the Seljuks, we're talking about Turks, yes, but highly Persified ones, that in fact inherited, as we'll see now, much of the Iranian military traditions locally. In fact, if you look at the early Seljuk military organization, well, it was basically along the traditional Islamic lines, right? Albeit surely incorporating some new features. So there were essentially some military zones as far as 24 that would equate essentially to some governorates, some districts, each in fact under a regional commander. The point of this in the Iranian plateau, and this was a practice dating back to for a very long time from whichever people had ruled over it, were essentially seat of, in fact, nomadic settlements, right, that were thus gradually sedentarized, that, however, were organized also politically and territorially more or less along the same lines that they had in the steppes. I mean, there were, again, some areas of Iran that were very developed from millennia. They had cities, they had kind of industries, a very, in fact, developed military administration. And we'll see now in a while, in fact, to which extent the Seljuks used this. But naturally, the position of Iran, south of Central Asia, was essentially the ideal, especially in the north and in the east, that were more brutal, more primitive, wilder in many ways, to settle these populations. That thus would remain essentially in a frontier area, so shielding Iran in part, at least, from other Central Asian movements, and that would provide this inexhaustible pool of fresh forces, mostly light cavalrymen. Again, all these scumbags literally arrived from literally everywhere as quickly as they knew that there was a sedentary army moving, and so they could simply join it as freebooters and simply laying waste everything they found in front of them, and not even being paid technically, because they were just in for the loot, and that's how also the locals would use them for. Plus, naturally, some chiefs, some elements, like in the case of the Seljuks, that naturally had taken over the system in part from the within, but still as essentially now a Turkic dynasty that stretched from Anatolia to southeastern Arabia, from the Caspian Sea to southeastern Iran. So again, we're talking about really huge amount of territories populated by different communities, and so you have all these regional variations, but the most important core was Western Iran. That it was the area that historically had developed the most, and again provided with this important balance / hybrid between sedentarism and nomadism. It would always characterize Persian warfare in a way or in another. Such district commanders we were talking about before had the task of raising, training, and equipping a specific number of troops every year. Bear in mind that these were people who fought every year, right? The steppes custom doesn't even require properly a statal structure to provide with the means. Like the entire world works like that, right? It's extremely pressured to achieve that with an appalling scarcity of resources. So in Iran, there would be actually a compromise between, again, this brutal, primitive steppe element and the military organization of an advanced kind culture that would provide with extra, elements, let's say, this ethnic ones. Provincial commanders would muster their contingents at a prearranged spot to spend the good season either training or on campaign. That sometimes was literally the same thing, meaning that there was always someone to crush here and there, had they been just brigands or whatever. But just, the whole point of fighting every year was to keep this military machine well oiled, and thus having the deterrent capacity to maintain the Seljuk Empire, at least to the degree, would still identify itself under a same dynasty or things like that, because otherwise, naturally, these provincial rulers would autonomize themselves discreetly. There was a sudden process of professionalization in Seljuk times. This derived from one side to the increased bellicosity of the region. Naturally, a system had now crumbled and another one had been conquered in arms, so there were still fresh energies to spend, and because of the aforementioned feudalization of the system, the final collapse, let's say, of a broader, even of the same caliphal capacity to retain essentially a centralized state of control, the Seljuks basically hijacked / patronized the Abbasid caliphs. The Seljuks were Sunni, as essentially most Turks. However, they had to compromise with the Iranian majority of Shia Muslims, especially again in this kind of essentially core heartland they had based their empire on. Naturally, the newly converted Turks were essentially religious fanatics, because they had all the anxiety to fit in, to prove they were better than the decadent caliphs and so on. So they coupled a very superficial understanding of Islam to their military brutality, and to an important effect, of course, as far as the conquest was concerned, but then with, again, big problems in maintaining a unitary rule, which was somehow a mirage. And this is not even to say that there were bad governors per se. It's just that, again, the territory they conquered was huge and too different and agitated by too many internal forces just to remain intact, unitary. So the Turks brought with them also a greater sense of what properly a military elite was. As we've seen with the Dalai Lamas, for example, there we have actually what is already an exception by the 10th, 11th century, properly a warrior people, right, with kind of, in theory, like a large bulk of free men fighting on foot and so on. The Turks arrived because in Central Asia you have, as we were saying before, an ultra-elite, meaning that there are a very few but ultra-heavy rulers from the most successful tribe, and then basically an ocean of lighter, impoverished, defeated subjects, in fact, that have lost great part of their strength, as they are subjects and not rulers themselves. So when the Turks settled in the semi-sedentary areas and beyond, they began to mitigate that step background in a more sedentarily feudal sense. So there is a great similarity, as we will see now, between the Seljuk knights and the Western ones during the Crusades, when they faced one another. So ferocious hatred could alternate with great, respect. Exactly on this kind of chivalric code of honor and lifestyle that somehow looked indeed very similar. Also, the Arabs had a sort of chivalric code on their own. This did even influence part of the Western one at a point, and vice versa, of course. So it's difficult even to draw radical boundaries between these cultures. However, definitely the Turks had something much more chivalrically feudal than the Arabs, right? And so more similar actually to the Franks by this point. Without mentioning in all this, and I made videos about it, and that this area of Western, say at least the Caucasus, but the thing went as far as the Caspian Sea, and surely even, as we will see now, with Western presence even beyond the Crusades in this Western Iranian region, of lots of Western knights, right? The Normans, the Franks, right? I stress the Normanness, not just because at the Battle of Manzikert, as you know, there were, at least in the campaign, some important Norman contingents. These were essentially Western mercenaries fighting for the Byzantines, but that had historically been roaming around since the Viking era in and around these areas to even carve seigneuries on their own, small ones, but being known, right, by and knowing in this case, the rising Turks, right? So the West didn't all of a sudden one day wake up with the Seljuks taking Jerusalem and deciding to go to crusades, not knowing what hell there was there. Everybody knew everything about the picture. It was full of Westerners that regularly fought in these armies, in the Seljuk ones themselves. We don't have overwhelming evidence of enormous number, but we know that they were there, and they knew each other. We know they naturally had lots in common in terms even of equipment. We will see it now in depth, right? Because the kite-shaped shield, for example, is something that emerges exactly around this point pretty much everywhere. We see them in Europe, we see them in the Byzantine Empire, we see them even among the Seljuk Turks. And it doesn't make sense even to say where was it born first, right? Evidently, if it spread so far and wide, it's because it was a need of those times, warfare, and it may have well to do with actually an increase in mounted combat as far as also in missile fire, right? And this is true both in the West and in the East. It's obvious again that the aforementioned statal centralized systems had somehow collapsed by this point, so professionalization did correspond to that level of army privatization that we were pointing out before. There was, however, in this Western Iranian territory, it is quite wide and diversified even climatically and so on. Some areas are hot deserts, others are kind of even cold mountains, etc. There was still space for some Turkoman horsemen to be still living at the outskirts of civilization, operating as semi-official gazes, raiding enemy territory. Right. This was not true, just as we were saying before, for the East, for the Central Asian frontier, but also in the West, and especially the Byzantine frontier that was quite mountainous, was in fact in the Islamic Caucasus at this point, and was just useful for everybody involved because, whenever you have a gray area where there's a lot of instability but very few local resources, in fact, to centralize, even great empires are relatively okay with that if it wasn't for the fact that the Byzantines wanted to conquer, in fact, the Tigris Valley. They started opening properly in Mesopotamia from the north, and that's also how the campaign of Manzikert began, by the way. So operating actually in areas that were far outstretched both for Constantinople and the Seljuks at that point. Naturally, the Seljuk military was was quite advanced, right, and was acquiring also lots of polyurcetic capacity. They would have arrived as far as Syria. They would naturally, after Manzikert, settle in Anatolia proper. The Sultanate of Rum was established by always trying to escape properly the direct Seljuk control. And there were lots of other peoples actually that poured together with the Turks after Manzikert, including the Kurds, even some Rusians. So the situation there was quite complicated. In any case, we're talking about raiding warfare, and you know that at the outskirts of the Islamic world, essentially all the various heretics, sects, fanatics, whatever, and or just people that wanted to, like the marabouts in Africa, wanted just to create some hermitage to cultivate their martial spirit, right? Like the monastic military orders in the West, for the sake of the jihad, were present, were sent. Some were outcasts, exiles, and so on. So those areas were quite turbulent. Albeit, again, there was not major power in them, but that was an interesting place where to, for example, school the new commanders to be acquainted with this ferocious hit-and-run tactics, scorched earth strategies, and more. The Ghulams, or Mamluks, had by this point injected in the Islamic world a much higher degree of discipline, heavier armor, improved training, thus rendering also the local militaries more versatile, right? As we were saying before, the Central Asian tradition was somehow more dynamic, just in terms also logistical organization, of capacity of mobilizing more troops in a larger space. So the Arab world had a bit gentrified over time, but it still kept contributing with significant forces, especially the city militias were particularly fine and supportive of the shock mounted element, useful for sieges. They had the Arabs schooled even the Chinese in artillery warfare, right? So they were something themselves. However, the Ghulams and Mamluks formed at the core of the Seljuk forces. The full-time askar, or personal following, I made a video about the Seljuk askaris, I re-uploaded it recently, was the nucleus around which a larger army could be formed when the need arose. Right, you were located in places, I don't know, like Mosul or Aleppo, so you combined that kind of tribal, feudal kind of prestige by ruling a rich sedentary settlement, and you were always surrounded by your retinue, in fact, your slave soldiers, this de facto devotees that think that you are acting with a degree of divinity, right? And from there, you also have enough resources from the city, the know-how, the military engineers, you have all the agricultural surplus of the province, etc. So it's a place where you gather your forces, and again, as soon as this happens, you're sure that from this the mountainous Mashrek and beyond, you have lots of this war bands of freebooters, of renegades, of religious fanatics. It will simply just substantiate, strengthen your ranks, and will operate just like some antennas around your heavier force that will essentially stand there, right, and send all these lighter elements, mostly horse archers, ahead. We've seen it in several videos about Crusader battles, to harass the enemy, essentially screening also the bulk of your forces, just like at the Battle of Manzikert. The Byzantines didn't know up to the very last days that the full bulk of Alper's land forces was there. And then you would strike the enemy with this last charge. And don't think that this was an all-winning tactic. Actually, the fact that you had to rely just on a small, it doesn't matter how good, but still contained numerically, nucleus of forces, and because you had essentially just horse archers, and this was the typically Turkic, Seljuk military organization, means that you have for the most light cavalry that cannot break, can just try to wear out the enemy at a distance, and very often, say, Byzantine or Crusader armies, or even the ones of some other Islamic powers, it's just Egypt, that was much more kind of sedentarily Western looking than the Turkic world, were very often very tough nuts to crack, right? So the odds were pretty evenly balanced. The Ghulam's tactics included zone or shower shooting, both in open battle and in sieges. This technique required constant practice, great skill. Right, precision fire was not important. Important was to harass the enemy, especially with orderly volleys, if possible. Things would get more disorderly, actually, but with various parties going back and forth, etc. But the idea of putting an enemy under pressure and just unnerving him and softening him up adequately before the impact was quite important. The fact that this was done also to suppress the enemy on some ramparts, fortifications of sort in siege warfare is quite significant, because it shows also how invested these forces were in assaults. Right, the stormtroopers element is always the heavy cavalry that has to dismount to storm the enemy battlements. That's how you operate. You don't send the lights to carry out the assault, right? So there is a great there is a development property of a figure that would remain one of the men at arms gradually again. So the knighthood, a bit like saying the Western one, developing. The Ghulams were also trained, in fact, for close combat. Chiefly among each other, right? And the Turkic tradition had all a great legacy of, let's say, of effectiveness, right? Not just because of their heavy armor, but say the sense that in order just to be selected as a warrior, you had, for example, to test yourself, like, I don't know, pulling the enemy horse's tail by riding next to him unarmored. So much so that very often Seljuk leaders would arrive on the battlefield just with a simple tunic, because it was kind of this ascetic way of war for which you don't even need technology to prove that you're spiritually superior to the enemy. There's a lot of symbolism attached to that we can discuss in another video. Horse armor was significantly there. The steppes elite had always put great care in the protection of their horses, because naturally they're easy targets, and in the steppes you're just constantly under, sometimes it rains water, sometimes it rains arrow with that same frequency. So you must be protected substantially well. The best protection for the horse archers is just the volume of fire they can't put up, because otherwise it's useless. It's just like the reason why we stopped using metal armor after muskets kicked in. It's better to invest in the muskets than in the armor. So there are two types of horse armor, by the way, that we can document in this area. So bear in mind, always a heavily Persified one. They're both decorated with tassels in the at least in some iconographic sources, that makes them identical to those on a presumably fabric-covered aventail, right? The first type does not include anything for the animal's neck or head, significantly enough. Also, that we get just from iconographic evidence very often that the horses had shan fronts or something like that. So it was, say that the armor as a broader set there could be composed of different pieces, but the body armor for the horse mostly tended to cover the larger body. The other type is identical in shape actually to the 3rd century European bard in comparison, except for the fact that instead of being made in 2 separate pieces divided by the saddle, right, in the length of the horse, it seems to have been cut like an oversized horse blanket, so with openings at the front and the back, and with slits at the side so that the horse could be freer in movement. Written sources list the Ghulam elite equipment as lance, javelin, sword, bow, mace, lasso, hauberk, and helmet with coif and aventail. Right. The most important weapon being the lance, as we will see now. There were substantially shock charge tactics pioneered by the Turks at this point. But you understand here the degree of individual training, aside from the collective one, it also was astonishing. You have a lance, then javelins. At some point, these weapons could be confused to consider, just like in Norman times, the same ones you have initially, just guys still before the couché lance grip. Also, the guy just running in front of the enemy and throwing him a dart and pulling back. Then a sword, a bow, right? A mace. Mace is especially anti-armor. Then a lasso. So there was a lot of heavy zootechnical and kind of capacity and horsemanship. Especially surrounded enemies could be tied down and unhorsed. You have a cuirass, essentially a helmet with coif of aventail. These were important because, again, arrows could really land everywhere. So if you wanted to cover some of the most vulnerable points, the Westerners would take a bit. They had kind of less of this arrows showers in Europe, so they mostly would develop helmets would just keep some very narrow eye slits open, because they mostly would point with the lance at each other's faces. But the Turks also did that. They had sometimes properly mask helmets. Also, the Mongols had similar tactics, etc. And the Byzantine princess Anna Komnena states that the Ghulams were essentially even more chivalrous than the European crusaders, which is, considering what she said about the latter, actually praising their military skills and their chivalry in the sense of kind of also fanatic egalitarianism that did exist by some degree also among the especially the slaves, right? They had this common status and also were distinguished by the rest of society. A complement still to both, fundamentally. There are some contacts, indeed, between the Seljuks and the Westerners, as we were saying before, in different directions. For example, the European winged mace that starts appearing around this time, develops also in later medieval warfare, was almost certainly based upon either a Byzantine or Islamic prototype, and the most likely place of origin in this sense was exactly West Iran, right? This weapon naturally would have been developed in a way or another because of the increased level of armoredness, but let's say the design, that the winged mace is typical of this area. We have also some early depiction, for example, from some decorated bronze mirror, probably from Iran, dating to the 11th, 12th century, today preserved at the Louvre in Paris. The evidence of a horseman carrying a large and deeply convex round shield, with his spear high under his armpit in the European couché manner, right? Actually, this was designed for frontal charge, right? In spite of the fact that here in the picture it seems to be used against an animal attacking from the rear. It's plenty of, hunting scenes, way more than in Western art for reasons, religious reasons, and others that we can't explain now. However, as far as the large shield is concerned, and the couple with the couché legs accordingly, we think that such pair was developed specifically in West Iran, right, or the Islamic Caucasus, or even Seljuk. Anatolia, there may have been some kind of mutual influences with Western tactics there, and it's important to stress. Then there is a Barkava Gulsha, a manuscript of Persian epos, probably from the Adarbayan in the late 12th or early 13th century. It's today preserved at the Topkapi Library in Constantinople, because I still call Istanbul like that, of course. That displays, actually, I couldn't find the copyright-free pictures because apparently it's all off limits as far as commercial use is concerned. But it shows, it's beautiful. You can find at least the pictures on Google, because it shows, first of all, a considerable degree of uniformity, particularly as regards armor, which, especially consider that the degree of armoredness, the numbers of armors, etc., displayed, it's very high, and it could hint at a greater material surplus that Persia was able to provide to the, as we've seen, traditionally poorer, materially speaking, Central Asian warfare. The shields are a bit more varied, right? This is perhaps not so interesting, except for one particular type. Others are bucklers, that are kind of larger, round, very convex types of, etc. But there is one that is indeed kite-shaped, being quite common, by the way, in this iconography, mostly among infantrymen or dismounted horsemen, though. This aspect is important because in Europe, at this point, shields were evolving towards another direction, but up to that point, as you know, also foot soldiers or dismounted knights could use, in fact, the kite-shaped shield. And in the Islamic Middle East, the kite-shaped shield seems to have been mostly an infantry weapon, right? It would have not been, again, so rare also in the West. We will have to make videos especially about that. But it still suggests that, at least in this case, aside from the of course the similarities in the shape and all, different, say, the same weapons could be used in different ways, or at least could be preferentially used by different types of units and or tactical and arms specifically. So speaking of the Kurds, these came to prominence, militarily speaking, towards the end of the Seljuk period, right? They formed, as you know, the initial basis of Ayyubid power in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. The Ayyubids being substantially a Kurdish dynasty, surely with mixed background, but stemming exactly from this bit more essentially frontier area, some of those kind of more warlike backgrounds between essentially the Seljuks, the Crusaders, the Caucasus. Definitely a place where a lot was going on in terms of military influence and so on. They emerged, at least in this period, as effective cavalry. Naturally, as we've seen, this was a quite equestrianly developed era, right, in place, right? So the Ayyubids specifically had this relatively large horses wearing generally even heavier armor than the Arabs and wielding the sword as their favorite weapon. So a bit more of a even, say, not particularly steppe influenced reality just per se. Kurdish infantry is rarely mentioned, but it was surely quite important in the native lands. Just it's Kurdish cavalry to be recorded as mercenary force in, for example, Ghaznavid service, even before the rise of Salah ad-Din and the Ayyubids themselves as a ruling dynasty. The Kurds also served naturally in the Seljuks, especially in Anatolia, and as auxiliary forces for the Mamluk sultans in Egypt and Syria after the Ayyubid era. Incidentally, we were talking about the siege of Acre a couple of weeks ago, and we saw how there were still some Ayyubid branches, such as the one of Amma, surviving in relative obscurity after they had fallen out of power and the Mamluks had risen to the point that the latter wouldn't consider them even essentially a threat, right? It was in Ayyubid service, however, that the Kurds played their most important military role, right? And partly because the Ayyubids were kind of stemming from those lands as well. There was a free-born professional cavalry that can explain here also the difference from the Ghulams and the Mamluks that still served in Ayyubid armies, right? So much so that they would eventually take power and found a dynasty on their own. However, these Kurdish free-born professional cavalry was quite prized, even among those military systems that were based on the Ghulams and on the Mamluks, right? They weren't in Kurdish lands. They weren't quite like permanent forces because they were essentially feudal lords fighting a bit with the sense of independence, also of their own prerogatives and so on. It wasn't quite like a Kurdish power, a Kurdish state or polity that could simply, channel them into some more regular forces, right? Then there were other war bands serving as tribal auxiliaries for naturally lesser rates of pay, where also infantry was important. There were mountaineers among them as well. Now this was the picture we meet with before the Mongol invasions that, as you know, put the Middle East upside down. Not just they destroyed Baghdad, but they established eventually the Ilkhanate as a major regional power. There was a vacuum, especially in the Jazira, that was not adequately filled nor by the Mongols nor by the Mamluks, that from the other side had managed to stop the former and to stabilize that frontier that would last basically to this day, a broader international sense. And actually, the Mongols change a lot in the Middle Eastern warfare. However, we will see now how, in the case of Persia, that was essentially the most powerful, namely Mongol power in the region, lots of, in fact, Iranian military and also Arab, by the way, or Arab-derived military tradition remained, fueling essentially the Ilkhanate, right? Whose armies remained famous. I made videos about the Mongol Empire's disgregation, the Ilkhanate. We already, again, discussed about their military, so you can find all this. I think there is probably a playlist on the Ilkhanate I made. And while it was clear, in fact, that the native warriors, Turkic, Persian, Arab, or whatever, Kurdish, were militarily inferior to the Mongols. I mean, the Mongols really came, again, I made a series last autumn explaining a bit of how the Mongol army functioned, and, indeed, they demonstrated to be the superior force. The local military systems were integrated in the Mongol army. Right? The Mongol army could have not ruled Persia if it hadn't taken control of the cities, of the districts, of the previous mechanisms of military administration. And you can easily see it just in the Ilkhanate armament, right? That does bear like an enormous trace of the Iranian substratum at many levels, both for individual panoplies and artillery, etc. Troops from these places, by the way, kept fighting further afield as mercenaries. There are many manuscript illuminations from the Ilkhanate. We are in the 13th, 14th century. In the latter one, especially, we have like an important, say, wealth of sources that we cannot ask for the 10th or the 11th, of course. The most of these works are the Shahnameh, for example. So they're all chivalric epics, and they represent a lot of cavalrymen, and whoever has ever gotten interested in medieval Persian warfare has always seen these beautiful pictures. And there are really lots of sources that today we cannot cover in detail. Perhaps I can make a dedicated video, but we can say that there is an homogeneity between what the sources regarding at this point the most evident Mongol standard that, at least iconographically, we are presented with in these illuminations. And in fact, they all get down mostly to the same elements, right? We have, first of all, an important degree of homogeneity within the same manuscript illuminations, meaning that it was an idea that more or less horsemen at that point looked quite similar to the heavy ones, that naturally a bit like the heroes, the cuirassed ones, like in the West you mostly see men-at-arms in plate armor, and rather than, say, a lighter infantryman of some sort. And of course, there's plenty of lamellar cuirasses. I did make videos similarly about Central Asia for the same period, so there we saw how much stuff actually poured in Mongol warfare from these local cultures, sometimes even some forgotten ones in the steppes that, however, for the time were quite advanced, and the Mongols derived stuff from. The original Mongol equipment, as we've seen, was incredibly primitive and rudimental, right? The Mongols there, and This is the impression I've gotten the more I studied them in some depth, and actually they were extremely primitive. I mean, it's pretty obvious if you consider what the Mongols were, but as far as the military picture that we almost presented is that they were so advanced, yes, of course, because of China, in part, but what I mean is that even when they invaded the West, that, as you know, happened in the Western Eurasia, let's say, they were still pretty, when they destroyed Baghdad, for example, still really very primitive, also technologically speaking, but by a degree. Were just very well organized, very well motivated, very well led, disciplined, trained. It was that dramatic potential of the steppe that was being unleashed, right? Then we have, also thanks to the wealth of these local powers, they had conquered an increase in, for example, armor. So you see here all these long lamellar cuirasses, right, covering well up to the thighs, and so on. Aventails everywhere. Sometimes we don't understand whether it's metal or cloth. From the pictures, doesn't matter. The word there's this very strong closed armored profile. Aventails are represented at times with collars on the shoulders, are apparently made of the same material of the main armor, so properly metal lamellae, right, in the heavier cases. And some of these were decorated with fabric at the same time. This we see also in the West. Sometimes plate armor was covered with some fabric of sort and or painted, right? So that things looked much more colorful than we usually think. There were surely, kind of softer armor, and we will see now also why they are important, because they may represent, in fact, the original, say, the native troops that were in the ideal of the sources more lightly equipped than the Mongols, a bit in that steppe sense, right? That there is the elite and then the subjected peoples that do not get the best panoply. Weapons include winged maces, large bladed spears. Archery is properly attributed by these sources mostly to the Mongol element, to the ethnic Mongol element, so the Easterners, right? While from some quivers and armor, we see that the softer, the softer element was the native one, right? The idea these were cheaper gear, thus could be afforded just by the Persians, and on average, and not by the Mongols. Naturally, there was plenty of Persian troops that fought in the Ilkhanate army that were the heaviest thing ever, also by Mongol standards, but they were surely less, at least at the beginning, before essentially the Mongols blended in. They got Persified as well, as it had happened with the Seljuks. There is also an important and a clear distinction in the drawings between the curved eastern saber and the normally straight double-edged broadsword of the Persians, that some people say it's of the Arabs, but it's also kind of properly the Iranian tradition of the steppes, also in Indo-European times, because before the Turks and the Mongols, you actually don't have sabers around. And it's not easy to explain why, but probably it has to do with the fact that the straight sword required actually more training than a saber. Thus that, again, greater social stratification present in the Turkic world that we just documented in the among the Seljuks compared to the previous Iranian mountaineers, for example, is an explanation. The Indo-Europeans were somehow more egalitarian, up to a certain point at least, compared to the Turks. And sometimes it's difficult from such manuscripts to simply look at the pictures and say, well, this is how it was. There are lots of artistic licenses. Maybe it's archaisms sometimes, but the distinct impression that we get is that the difference in, for example, the styles of the quivers, that are easily distinguishable between the nomads and the sedentaries. The fact that in the Arab, Iranian, and then Turkic tradition there would be more mail armor, right, more straight swords compared to the lamellar and armor and sabers of the Mongols. Definitely shows this clear divide between the invaders and the natives. There will be a lot to say about, again, lots of these details from the illuminations, because some of them are interesting just opologically speaking, but they're not even such a huge deal, and it's just a drawing, right? So naturally we see a great level of technological advancement by this point. Consider that even the increase in armor among the men-at-arms at this point is normal also for the West, right? There is a crisis in the 14th century. Thus, the soldiers become ever more soldiers, and the rest of the people get ever more demilitarized. And at the same time, there is a sort of also statalization, right? Also industrialization of the armament production, for example, that in Persia, as we've seen, was quite advanced from a significant amount of time. And when we look also at scale-lined horse armor, lamellar horse armor, of course, we realize this increases in Mongol times through, again, this Ilkhanate iconography is incredibly rich. That's the impression that we get. But that stuff may have, however, still been around in the previous centuries, in Seljuk times, says, and just having gradually decreased, right, disappeared, not just because of the sedentarization, because that armor was, may say, more typical of the steppe, but also because of the unavoidable change in nature from the steppe to the sedentary world, or the semi-sedentary one, if you want. So when the Mongols arrived, they reinject this, and so rather than a new introduction, it's maybe just a revival. Plus, on a base of, again, of what is developing ever more as a state, without ever kind of more advanced administration and so on, that can produce, say, arms and armor even in a more consistent way for at least those forces that are ever more the professional ones in the picture, right? Another very important element in this regional warfare is Western influence, right? We are in the West, again, because of the Vietnam syndrome, always thinking that, oh my god, this East was so, beyond. We were always influenced by the East. It's also a bit of kind of a leftistic idea that, look at the Westerners, they thought they were the best ones. Instead, also other peoples had civilization. We would have known, But there is very often actually also the other way around. That is to say, a Western influence, in this case specifically Persian warfare, which is something that you wouldn't normally hear, and that was there consistently. This stemmed chiefly from mercenaries from Europe, as well as, by the way, from other places. I mean, I'm not saying that Europeans were majority, of course, but that were, we stressed the Western side because, of course, the West was sedimenting a hell of a military culture on its own, and the Persians were interested in this for many reasons. For example, crossbowmen seem to have been prominent. Also, heavy cavalry may have been there. We don't know too much, but, for example, Italian sailors or marines are mentioned in the sources, serving in the Black Sea. Not only though, because some were recruited by the Ilkhanate for military operation in the Persian Gulf, right? At least we don't have a proof whether they ever got there, but there is a Hebrew Italian source that states how in the 13th century some Italian sailors, as well as Italian and other Western European merchants, knew a lot about the Indian Ocean, and considered at this point the Pax Mongolica had opened all the routes, so it was full of Westerners as far as China, right? And that these troops had been hired specifically by the Ilkhanates, right? So there is more than one hint of the fact, naturally, we're talking about submerged realities that we cannot document extensively, right? Because the East writes in another way, right? Not obviously in a linguistic sense, but literally in the type of properly of source production. We know just much less about it. It's not even about the contemporary historiographies that sometimes do not do their job to the fullest, but literally the fact that they produced less sources at the time compared to the West. In fact, a lot of things that we know about this local warfare starts also coming in this late Middle Ages from Western sources that document a lot, really, just systematically, and even without too much of a surprise. Actually, I made a video about this last year, a couple of years ago, actually. But it doesn't end here, because the Western influence, and especially the Italian one, seems to have been consistent since the 12th century, right? For example, we have some lost painted plate from Iran dating to the 12th century from the Kir collection in London. If the enumeration has remained the same, it's 151, the item. That displays military equipment that first of all has much in common with contemporary Egypt and Syria, because of course Iran was quite connected with those countries as well, as we've seen. And one interesting aspect is especially a tall, almost mantlet-like infantry shield with a flat base, right? Now, this type of shield is relatively frequent also in the 12th century Italian sources, and we may believe that such shields depicted in Iran, and probably used there as well, thus, could have been imported from Italy. Scholars went as far as saying Genoa specifically, because at that point they were in conflict with the papacy for exporting weaponry and other military gear to the Islamic world. This had been a long problem also with Venice and Egypt, right? So we don't know exactly. In any case, Italy is like quite homogeneous military culture at this point, so whatever you find there is not one city or the other, but generally speaking the entire center and north, but also the south, really, that functions in the same way in terms of military technology. Thus, we can trace this connection. Consider that there are also some other types of equipment, for example, swords, in the Arab illustrations that are quite similar between Iran and Egypt. So it wasn't just Western military technology there, but it's surely present, and we can trace it remarkably. We even have a handle of an unspecified object. We don't even know whether it was a weapon. Maybe it was a mace. This is the item 150 from the same aforementioned Kir collection from Iran, dating to the 13th, 14th century. Now, we don't know what the hell this is, right? However, the closest parallels to this handle are the grips of heavy bladed weapons, perhaps falchions, right? That kind. For example, if you look at the famous Maciejewski Bible of the mid-13th century from northern France, there are some Italian wall paintings that show the same type of grip. Like, you realize that this stuff may have come from there as well, right? Finally, there is a similarity in another source between from Iran between daggers hanging vertically from belts and the same method of hanging such daggers, which appears in early 14th century Italy and Germany. So we don't know whether it's maybe a coincidence or if there was some mutual influence, which could have gone both ways, given that, I don't know, at this point there were some German and Italian crusaders fighting in Asia Minor, for example, so that could have been an occasion in which they could have purchased or imitated eventually weapons, technologies, whatever, from one another. Despite, as we've seen, the significant cultural and military contacts during the Mongol period, Western Iran and the neighboring regions that we looked at today seem to display actually a slow absorption of Central Asian military styles, right? This is an important concept, because before we looked at those illuminations and we expressed the same concept, but the degree by which this is true might have been much larger. Again, the Mongols weren't much of a civilization. Eventually, the ones ruling China remained in China, right? The ones ruling over Persia remained in Persia. So the idea is that if you look at the picture over time, of course, the entire Eurasia was influenced by Mongol armament, right, and styles and whatever. However, right, some developments have to be attributed to just the implementation operated by local craftsmen, right? And Iran, that has always been a civilization and has always produced important weaponry in traditional styles, may exactly display such tendency more, right? Something bordering mass production seems to have been in place there, right? Something even possibly in advance of the contemporary European armaments industry. It was quite advanced. I propose to look better at this in another video, because again, we don't know as much as we would like to know. But just the political and territorial control of Iran always brought to this, to the, say, the continuity, not the dispersion of the local, settlements, the development of the local production capacities and so on. So this thing, with such hellish military cultures like the Seljuk one, the Mongol one, surely reinforced itself also towards a kind of a more centralized production. That naturally is a big word for the time being, but that was happening in a subtle direction. There are some examples of this that I picked. For example, there is an inlaid bronze celestial globe made by Muhammad ibn Mu'ayyid al-Ard in Iran, dated to 1278. This is preserved today at the Mathematisch-Physikalische Salon in Dresden, Germany. And it displays like the illustration of early forms of straight broad-bladed swords, which by this point, so Mongol times, Persia, shows how the Iranian straight broadswords of the previous centuries were still being at least represented in this case, and known, and kind of probably even still used materially. This is just iconography, but it's meaningful because it's on the same pattern of the models we know before. Then we have bronze hammer maces, or war hammers. The stuff, speaking of also various influences that Iran may have received also from the neighboring places. The stuff is dated from the 11th to the 13th century. It's not easy sometimes to date certain weapons, but more or less, right? These are essentially small axes at a first glance that in terms of decoration, this is very Persian, right? Do not find a parallel in the Middle East. However, they are more like war hammers. The curved spike or hook at the back of one example is also very similar to the one of some infantrymen, sometimes even peasantry, in the Byzantine and Armenian art, right? So this could mean either like an influence from those places and maybe an origin from Azerbaijan, for example, or even the same Armenia, because the frontier is very arduous to define precisely there. And they are probably developing also from certain types of maces known as gurds that had been traditional in the area, also among the Dailamius. We have an inlaid bronze candlestick from the still the aforementioned Azerbaijan, dating to the late 13th century. This is preserved at the Museum of Turkish Art. Item 112 in Constantinople. There is just a picture here, which is the one of a huntsman with a spear, and it looks definitely like the Christian iconography of St. George, to say the least. So it's possible that through some Anatolian channel, right, some Western art poured in these places, and naturally there were some universal symbolism regarding also the idea of the hero slaying the dragon, etc., that was pretty much alive, even in Iranian culture, of course, from innumerable time with Ouroboros, the hero breaking the cycle of the waters and all this stuff. Then we have a painted relief tile from 13th century Iran. This is preserved in the Islamic section of the Staatliche Museen of Berlin. And here we can appreciate, aside from the fact there is a warrior without armor and has an almost straight proto-saber, so we don't know whether this was a development occurring just in in Seljuk times or whatever that would prefigure the explosion of sabers, especially in Mongol times. We have an helmet, right, that is especially interesting because it not only has a riveted rim, but it may also have a comb across its crown. And such method of helmet construction was common in late Roman and Sasanian times in the Middle East. It surely survived in early Islamic times. Here, however, we are in the 13th century, and this method of helmet construction is to be seen normally only in Europe. So we don't know how the thing really occurred. The interesting aspect is that, especially in the early time frame of today's video, we find still helmets that are Spangenhelm in construction, which is normal if we spend as far as the 10th century, also during the 11th. But this is quite interesting because remember, even if these were mostly Turkic-dominated times around the region, and at least massively influenced by the Turks, still the Indo-European standards were that kind of Spangenhelm, straight sword, etc. And in Iran, we do find a lot of that still, as we illustrated also in Mongol times. So, well, not the Spangenhelm, but still those kind of more male straight swords, sedentary quiver style, and so on. Finally, and inserted lots of pictures of these too, there are the Mine ware painted bowls. Some of the only representations of Seljuks derive from these. However, this was likely the piece here from the Freer Gallery, number 43.3, from Washington District of Columbia, United States, dates to around 1228. There were some stringent studies that could make the chronological indication so precise, which locates this painted bowl to Khwarezmian time. The Khwarezmians, today we didn't talk about that, we will do it in another video in fact, but they had their moment of glory. They, in the early 13th century, even managed to destroy Jerusalem at a point. I mean, they had an important power, and they came straight from essentially an Indo-European background of some sort, even though they were influenced by the Turks and all. But I discussed them, especially in that video about Islamic military music, where basically they topped the greatest show of kind of sacred music, embodied by literally, instead of the hero on the chariot with the horses and the divine wings, you have a drum, which, as you know, since ancient times in the Middle East, was quite of an important element in military music. And this Minai ware painted bowl displays a style which is definitely not Mongol in reason, right? It seems much more Seljuk in appearance, as far as, for example, the swords are straight and tapered, by the way. Some have curved hilts, and one bow cases and quivers in Middle Eastern forms, right? So there was definitely, even amidst the Mongol invasions and the issues that were occurring there, essentially massive swaths of essentially Iranian Turkic military resurgence, right? That surely the Mongols had to confront themselves with, and it may not be so strange for them to have actually settled in the Ilkhanate for good, because that was the place from which most of this military output was being produced. right? So there would be actually a lot more to tell, especially as far as the Shahnamas are concerned, but we, I think, got the essentials for this kind of video, and there is always hopefully the possibility of going more in depth with others in the future. For today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.